You're listening to the Bloom Europa podcast, a project that privileges new and independent thinking on Europe while discussing its current challenges. In each episode, we take a holistic but hard-hitting approach to analysing pan-European affairs.
Hello everyone, my name is Adérito Vicente and I'm your host for today's show. In this episode we explore a pressing question: will Ukraine join NATO? Our guest is Ambassador Stephen Pifer, a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and an affiliate of the Center for International Security and Cooperation at the Stanford University. He is also a former US ambassador to Ukraine. As a leading expert in nuclear arms control, Ukraine, Russia, and European security, Stephen Pifer has offered commentary on these issues on National Public Radio, PBS NewsHour, CNN, and BBC, and his publications have been featured in a diverse array of outlets and imprints. With over 25 years of service at the State Department, he held crucial roles such as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. Additionally, served as a special assistant to President Bill Clinton, and he was also a senior director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia on the National Security Council. So, Stephen Pifer is the perfect authority to shed light on the unique dynamics and provide valuable insights into the captivating topic of Ukraine's pursuit of NATO membership. Before we proceed, it's important to note that this episode was recorded on the 1st of August, allowing us to capture the most up-to-date information available at the time. So, without further ado, let's delve into the challenges that Ukraine faces on its journey towards NATO membership, with the insights of our esteemed guest, Ambassador Stephen Pifer. Hello, Ambassador Stephen Pifer. Thanks for joining us. We are very pleased to have you here.
Happy to be here with you.
Yes, so let us begin our conversation by addressing the violation of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum on the security assurances and also Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a subject that you extensively written about, right?
Yes.
So what, in your view, led to this unfortunate turn of events? What went wrong?
Well, yeah, the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, that was where Russia, the United States, and Britain committed to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, its territorial integrity, its independence, and committed not to use force or threaten to use force against Ukraine. That was negotiated with then Russian President Boris Yeltsin. President Yeltsin, accepted the idea that Ukraine was a sovereign and independent state. And I think as become increasingly clear, particularly over the last 10 years, Vladimir Putin does not accept Ukraine as a sovereign independent state. That's the problem here. And we see, I think, in a way, is something of a imperialist war of Russia trying to regain territory that used to be part of the Russian Empire, but it's been, I think, made fairly clear by their resistance that Ukrainians desire to be an independent state.
But of course, we must also consider Ukraine's perspective. So,
yes.
What drives Ukraine's desire to join NATO, particularly at the light of this invasion by Russia?
Yeah, I think Ukraine's position about joining NATO has really changed in different ways over the past 30 years. I mean, in the 1990s, Ukraine decided that it wanted to have a good relationship, a partnership with NATO, but was not seeking membership. Then in 2002, after Russia and NATO agreed to deepen their partnership At that point, then President Kuchma announced that his goal was Ukraine joining NATO, although you didn't see the steps by Ukraine to actually prepare the way. I think there was an opportunity for Ukraine in 2006 to get a membership action plan from NATO. In fact, at that point, the Russians were not all that opposed, or at least they were not making that opposition public. And from my conversations with various officials in America and in Europe, it looked like Ukraine was on the track to a membership action plan. What derailed that was then President Yushchenko appointed Prime Minister Yanukovych as Prime Minister, and Yanukovych said he didn't want a membership action plan. NATO was not going to do a membership action plan with a country where the executive branch was divided. In 2008, President Yushchenko succeeded in getting Ukraine's request for membership action plan backed by both the Prime Minister, then Prime Minister Tymoshenko, and also Mr. Yatsenyuk, the Speaker of the Parliament. But at that point, Russian opposition was such that there was no consensus with the NATO on a membership action plan. The ironic thing here is that in 2010 to 2013, it looked like Ukrainian public interest in joining NATO was actually quite low. Then the president was Yanukovych. Yanukovych was not interested in joining NATO. But what's happened is, of course, with the Russian seizure of Crimea in 2014, Russia's involvement in the conflict in Donbass beginning in April of 2014, and then, of course, the all-out assault by the Russians in 2022, you've seen both government interest and public interest in Ukraine in joining NATO increase. I think it's understandable because they see NATO membership as a key to their security and perhaps avoiding a new attack in the future by Russia.
Let's go more in the specifics. How NATO membership would help Ukraine to deter or defend against those threats? Meaning the Russian threats.
Yeah, I believe right now Ukraine is on its own. And I believe the calculation in Kyiv is that, however this particular war ends, there could always in the future be a temptation in Moscow to try to renew the war, to try to grab more of Ukrainian territory. And I think in the Ukrainians, they see there's always going to be that risk, even though you have now this offer by the G7 to help arm Ukraine so that Ukraine will have a strong military in the future. The advantage that I believe Ukrainians see in NATO membership is it lies in Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, where NATO countries commit that an attack against one will be treated as an attack against all. And that would then face Russia if Russia were to decide to unleash a new war on Ukraine. It would not be just against Ukraine, it would be with the NATO alliance. And I think that's probably correct, is that the Ukrainians have it right that their best guarantee of security in the future would be full membership within the NATO alliance.
Thank you. Yes, but of course that will have challenges.
Yes.
So what are the key obstacles that Ukraine encounters on its path to membership? Before you answer, I would like to just put a bit of context to our listeners. For instance, in the latest NATO summit, they say that the alliance will support Ukraine in making these reforms of its path towards future membership. We will be in a position to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join in the alliance when allies agree and conditions are met. Because at the end of the summit, there was a press conference, probably you know about this, with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. And of course, the reporters were talking about what kind of conditions should be met, and even though it's in the communique, if you read it more carefully, he basically made like a political statement saying two ways that Ukraine should reach to this condition. So one thing is to complete these reforms in the military field, more engaging in NATO, culture. At the same time, with a focus on the democratic reforms and, of course, the fight against corruption, which actually has been made by the Americans recently. And the second part was the ending of the ongoing war. So the question is, besides the challenge that I've mentioned before, is that don't you think that Russia could exploit these conditions to prolong the conflict somehow?
Well, there is that risk. But on the other hand, if the Ukrainian military can decisively beat the Russian military, at some point, I think the Russians may have little choice but to either abandon their military objectives or get into a serious negotiation with the Ukrainians. I mean, I do believe at some point there will be a negotiation between Kyiv and Moscow. It can't happen now, first and foremost, because the Russians simply are not serious. We saw over the course of 2022 that while the Russian military was losing on the battlefield, the Kremlin escalated its demands of Kyiv. That's simply not serious. But I do think the war is a challenge, in that as long as the war is ongoing, there's going to be reluctance. And I think the press sometimes misportrayed it as simply reluctance in Washington and Berlin. My guess is that there are a significant number of other allies who are not prepared or were not prepared to say, yes, we can make Ukraine a member of NATO now while the war is ongoing, because that, in theory, would immediately trigger Article 5. My guess is that most NATO countries are not prepared right now to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. So I think that ongoing war is the big challenge for Ukraine, and that's why the Ukrainians could not get a short-term, immediate commitment to membership. Now, having said that, you quoted the language from the Vilnius summit in July on NATO's and Ukraine's future membership. Back in 2008 in Budapest, NATO said Ukraine will be a member. I think the Vilnius language is more significant, and that's because I believe that more and more NATO members now believe, in a way they did not believe back in 2008, that Ukraine should be a member of NATO, and that if ultimately you're going to have a stable and secure Europe, you need to have a secure Ukraine, and the best way to guarantee that is by bringing Ukraine into NATO. So in 2008, my perception, I mean, I wasn't involved in the negotiations, but my conclusion after talking to some people who were in the negotiations was that language about Ukraine will be in NATO. That was basically a consolation prize for the Americans who wanted to have a membership action plan for Ukraine, but certain countries, including Germany, opposed that. And I think they came up with that language as sort of a consolation prize so that President Bush came home from the summit with something regarding Ukraine. I think this was a different summit. My sense is that most, if not all, allies do see that ultimately Ukraine will be in NATO. The question is at what point that can happen. And that's a difference from Budapest.
Do you think that this NATO-Ukraine Council would help in pave the way, to make sure that other allies are a bit more skeptical would engage in this effort?
Yeah, I think the Council will be a mechanism by which Ukraine can begin the process of integrating into NATO, even if it may not have a specific membership invitation at this point. And it can also provide guidance. There were some questions, for example, I believe Ukraine has met most of the conditions that NATO asked aspiring members to meet. Although, say, had we gone back 2 years ago, before the Russian invasion in February 2022, I would have said that Ukraine still had to do a couple of things. One was reform the security service of Ukraine. And two was, and this is really in the anti-corruption area, take steps to further limit and reduce the political influence of the oligarchs. But Ukraine had shown, over almost 30 years, it's a democratic state. If you look at presidential elections in Ukraine, when presidents run for re-election in Ukrainian history, they usually lose. You've never seen that happen in Russia. So I think Ukraine, there may be a couple of small conditions they have to meet, but I think that they've made a lot of progress on that front. And so there are things that council can talk about that can help Ukraine prepare so that when the political opportunity arises, it is ready for membership.
Okay, so Ukraine's NATO membership will likely happen, of course, once the war is over. But of course, also this NATO-Ukraine Council will help to pave the way towards that goal, right? So that's basically, your main idea.
Yeah, that's how I see it. I mean, again, I think once this war is ended in some way, that to my mind opens up a possibility for Ukraine that Ukraine does not have now, because if there's a settlement and Ukraine comes into NATO, then the choice is on Russia. Russia has to make that choice if it's going to relaunch a new war against Ukraine. Is it prepared to fight NATO? That decision then is in Moscow. Right now, when the war is ongoing, the decision about a war between NATO and Russia, that would be made by NATO capitals, if they were to take Ukraine in now. So that seems to me a pretty significant difference. And again, does that give the Russians an incentive to continue the war? Perhaps, but I can also conceive readily that depending on what happens on the battlefield, that incentive may not overcome other reasons that the Russians may have for trying to find a way out of the war. And that includes, first and foremost, the large number of Russian casualties. I think, Western estimates now are 70,000 to 80,000 Russian soldiers killed in Ukraine and perhaps over 150,000 wounded. At some point, that's going to have, I believe, some resonance with the Russian public, who are going to get tired of seeing their sons, their husbands, their brothers coming home in body bags.
Indeed. So let's make the case that actually we are in the way to make sure that Ukraine will enter at NATO. But of course, there's always I think one important issue always for me in my head, and I think in the head of many nuclear scholars and also international relations experts, is that the question of Crimea. So how do you think that would unfold? Do you think that could be an issue for Ukrainians to give up on, for instance, in a moment, give up on Crimea, but in the meantime receive NATO membership? Do you think that would be the bargain? Because as you see in Georgia cannot actually apply for membership at NATO because they are not they're not willing to give up on their rights on the territories that have been occupied by pro-Russians or Russians.
My starting point is one. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the resulting states agreed to accept the 1991 boundaries. And under the 1991 boundaries, Crimea was a part of Ukraine. Now, I also think it's pretty clear that of all the parts of Ukraine that Russian forces have occupied, Crimea is the part that the Russians care most about, and that they will, I think, fight hardest to try to maintain control over that. If we go back 10 years, I could see there might be reasons why Ukrainians might say, is Crimea worth it? One is that my understanding was back in 2012, 2013, that for every dollar Crimea sent to the federal budget, it got $2 in return. It's got a population that tends to be relatively heavily weighted towards retirees. So I think there's some questions about how economically productive it is. While Crimea talks about tourism, I think it has a hard time competing in an open contest, for example, with Greece, Turkey, or southern France. So I think that there are reasons why Ukrainians might decide. But let me make the point, that is a decision for Ukrainians to make. And I don't think it is the right or the business of the West to try to suggest that kind of trade to the Ukrainians. If the Ukrainians come to that conclusion, I think, the West should support it. But on the other hand, the Ukraine here is the victim, and the West should be supporting of the Ukrainians in their goal, which right now is to recover all of their territory, which I think is an understandable goal.
Indeed. But but okay, but let's take the other way around. So imagine if the Ukraine bid to NATO doesn't work. Do you think that an alternative could be like a mutual defense treaty with United States, Ukraine,
Yeah.
United Kingdom, Ukraine, like we have, for instance, the United States have with South Korea or Japan or Australia?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that I would not exclude that. Although I think what you have right now on the table are security commitments that are now being negotiated bilaterally between Ukraine, United States, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Canada, the G7 members, on commitments they're prepared to make in terms of arming Ukraine so that in the future Ukraine has a modern, robust military. And I'm thinking here, I mean, equipped with things like Leopard tanks, Abrams tanks, F-16s, very modern Western military equipment that would make clear to the Russians that any fight would be really, really hard. And ideally, that would deter the Russians. So I think that's what the G7 envisages now. And that would also involve things like training support and intelligence support to the Ukrainians. I think it's another question, would you go beyond that to have a formal defense commitment on a bilateral basis? And certainly that's, I think, is in the realm of the possible. Although, again, if you're going to have the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Italy making those commitments on a bilateral basis, I guess I would ask, why not make them in the NATO context?
Yes, but at the same time, I'm not seeing France providing security guarantees to any country besides France. So
yeah, I think well, this is a question, and we'll find out, I think, as these negotiations proceed between G7 members and Ukraine, exactly how far they're prepared to go. In my own mind, I see these security commitments to Ukraine. It's kind of a way station. It's an intermediate stop for Ukraine on the way to what I believe should be the best guarantee for Ukrainian security, which is full membership within NATO.
Yes, I believe that the Britain and the US also did this kind of commitments when Finland and Sweden decided to join NATO.
Yeah, there were some commitments. Yeah. But again, those commitments, they didn't have the force of NATO membership in that when a country joins NATO, every member has to approve. So in the case of Sweden and Finland, you had a 2/3 vote in the US Senate to their accession. What Sweden and Finland had before that were executive branch agreements that didn't quite have the legal weight that membership has. I mean, and let me make one other observation. I mean, for years, I think there was this argument that the Russians made that NATO enlargement is somehow a threat to Russia. Well, from 2008 on, it was pretty hard to see NATO NATO didn't put Ukraine on a firm track towards membership. They didn't do it in 2008. They didn't do it in 2014. They didn't do it in 2019 or 2020. And the Russians then went ahead and invaded Ukraine anyway. So I think, the Russians previously might have had some claim to say countries should respect our concern about this. I believe that the Kremlin has forfeited any right to consideration of that concern by virtue of what they've been doing to Ukraine for the last 17 months.
Yes. So, okay, let's say that Ukraine goes to NATO. It's a NATO country. What would be the implications for security landscape in Europe? How much would be significant?
Again, I think, right now, what's the biggest threat to security and stability in Europe? It's Russia's war on Ukraine. If Ukraine membership in NATO prevents that, I think that greatly contributes to stability and security in Europe, and hopefully that inability on the part of Russia then to try to conquer part of Ukraine, that leads to a rethink in Russia. I mean, it seems particularly in the form of Vladimir Putin and his inner circle, they really are hung up on this idea of trying to restore part of the Russian Empire, part of the Soviet Union. If Ukraine is in NATO, maybe that causes the Russian leadership, whoever comes after Putin, and at some point there will be somebody else, to really look and say, how can Russia develop its resources and its potential as a normal country, that can have more normal relationships with Europe. But it's hard for me to see that kind of Russia until they abandon this idea of trying to recover what Putin refers to as historic Russian lands.
So, Ambassador Steve Pifer, on that note, thank you so much for your discussion and for coming to our podcast.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. We kindly invite you to subscribe to our podcast, which is available on Spotify, YouTube, and other platforms. You can also check out all the links and resources on the show's notes. That's all for this episode, folks, and we look forward to you tuning in next time. This was a Bloom Europa original.